All right, so our little oil pump is sitting right down in there, but in order to get him out, we got to take the flywheel off because it's in the way. If you try to loosen it up and wiggle it out of there, it gets hit on the bottom down there because it's kind of shaped like this, and there's just not enough room to pull that thing out of there. So as you can see, my chain's a little loose. It's not too bad. It's not hitting on anything. So I think we're okay there. What we need to do now is just take these bolts off to expose the gear, take the gear off, and then we can pull the little pump out. Alright, so there's our little cover. Now all we got to do is take that little gear off. Now there's no timing that goes to this. The only timing we got to worry about is this, timed to that, timed all the way up to the top up here. So once we get ready to put things back together, that'll be pretty easy. Alright, so the gear comes off, and we're getting closer. So we just want to take the chain off or move it out of the way. Either way it goes. So we'll just take it out. So now there sits our little bitty guy. Alright, so the only thing in between us getting this pump out is the 3 little bolts right there. And so all we got to do is pop them loose, and we'll have our oil pump out. Alright, so with the 3 bolts loose, all we got to do is pick the little guy up, and he'll come right out of there. Alright, so let's have a look-see at our little pickup screen and see if it's dirty. So it's got little tabs on it, and so what you got to do is open the little tabs up in order to pop this screen off here. And we'll push them back on there to keep the screen on. And there we go. So there is where the bottom of the oil, where it comes up from the sump. And here is our little pickup screen. And as we can see, it's really not that dirty. We can see through the screen. Everything looks good. A little bit of crud on it, but nothing spectacular. So I think we're okay on our pickup screen. So we can just reinstall that little guy. Snap him back up on there. And then get us a big set of channel locks. And what we want to do is pinch it back up onto the body there. And there we go. So now he's all back together. So the pickup screen is what I was hoping was going to be dirty. Turns out it's not dirty. So now we got to open up the little pump and see what's going on inside of there. Alright, so let's see what's going on inside the pump. So we've already cleaned the strainer out. It looked really good, so we didn't have any issues with oil not being able to get to the pump. So now let's take the pump apart and see what it looks like. So I've already broke this one free on the vise. It's really hard to get off. But now it's broke free, and you just take that one little bolt out, kind of hold it all together, and we'll take the pump apart. And it's real simple. You just have to make sure you put it back together the same way you took it apart. There's no gaskets or anything in there. And so all we got to do is you grab it and you hold on to the upper and you slide this part out. And so the upper part comes off, and you can see there's the seal for the pump on one side. Here's the little gears that go around that pump. And you'll notice that the top side has 2 little triangles. That has to be upward on it. And so then when you take this out, you'll be able to make sure that you line it up. Now I'm not going to take all the pins loose and everything. I want to inspect these surfaces, but I can tell you right now, the surfaces look pretty good on that one. If we hold this one up, you can see there's not any major scoring going on. We've got a little bit of scoring, probably impacting some of our pressure, but not significant. It's not really bad. And I'll show you in a minute with the first gen over here that is bad, that what bad looks like. So that's got a few marks on it, but it's really not bad. There's no high spots, and it's just normal wear after 30 years or so. So so that looks okay. This surface looks fine, and so there's no issues there. On the actual pump gears, they look okay. So then we got one more set here, so we split it apart one more time, and this one comes out with that one, and so this little guy is stuck in there. So this is the other side of the pump, and you can see kind of the same. There is there's one scratch there, but it's not deep. I can't catch my nail in it, and so that looks okay. And so all of those surfaces look good. That looks good. And then last is the back one back here, and you can see it's got a little bit of scoring. There's the pump itself, so no big issues there. So if I'm looking at it, if I go by the book, you would measure, put a flat across here and measure the gap, but just by looking at it, I can tell you it's not bad because there's not a lot of scores, so nothing's really worn so bad on it. So it looks like the pump is fine. So the pump apparently is not my problem. But while we're looking, let's look and see what a bad pump looks like. So this is my good pump. I'll put it back together. This is the pump that had all the crud in it from the first gen that I know the pump is bad. And so if I do the very same thing, if I pull it apart, you just slide that off, what you can see is there's a lot of scoring on that one. See how it's picked up a lot of crud and brought it through the pump over the years? So this one's scored up pretty bad, much more so than this one. And so that tells you, this pump probably should be replaced. And then we see the same right here. There's some marks on it where the contamination came through. And then if we pull the second set off, you see very similar. There's a lot of gouges. I can catch my nail in that one. So that one's really deep. So I'm losing a lot of pump pressure on this one. And the bottom's got some marks in it as well. So I can catch my nail on those marks. So this pump is probably not worth putting back together and putting on the bike. So we will just save him just for something to save and put him back up in the attic up there. But in general, I wouldn't be using this pump because this pump's not very good. So there's an idea of what a bad pump looks like right there with all that scoring in it. If you see a bunch of scoring, especially if you can catch your fingernail in it, you probably don't want to use that pump. You can just go ahead and buy another one. And then for sure, you got some good oil pressure coming from your pump. So we'll set this one aside and put him back up in the attic. So now we got to put this little fella back together. So in order to put it back together, now it's dry as a bone now. I didn't take all this out, so there's still a little bit of residual oil in there. But you can't have this start out dry because it's going to tear some stuff up. So what I want to do is take some assembly lube, and I'm going to more or less pack that pump. You can do it with oil. I'm just going to lubricate it up with some of this thick assembly lube and make sure that I get at least it starting pumping. And so what I want to do is put it anywhere in here. I don't want to get it on this surface because when I squeeze it back together, it's going to be in between. So I'm just going to fill up more or less the pump with assembly lube right here. And this stuff will get washed out by the oil anyway. So we put that on there, try to keep as much off of this sealing surface where it connects back together as possible. It wouldn't hurt a lot. Definitely don't want to have any contamination on there because it's going to keep the pieces from going back together right. So that right there. And then we take this little guy. We do the same thing. We just want to put some assembly lube around on him. Make sure it'll pick up and make sure that the surfaces that I wiped off are lubricated. That way it doesn't have to experience any damage as it's picking up its first oil. And then we just want to wipe these surfaces off. Make sure we get our pump to close back down. So you got to line up the little gear into the other gear, and then it'll slide back in there once you get it lined up. Alright, so then we got one more level to go. We do the very same thing. We're going to prime it with some assembly lube. So there we go. So nothing major to these little pumps, just a little 2-stage pump. And so once you put the screw back in there, it'll hold itself together in order to put it back on the bike. So we have determined that we don't have a big issue out of our pump itself. And so you can tighten this down on the bike once you get it on there, but just snug it down right now. And you just want to check after you get everything together and just make sure that the pump rotates. And so you can see right here where I got the assembly lube, when I rotate it, it's pushing that assembly lube. And we can put this back together and go on to the other side of the bike because it looks like we're okay on our pump. We just got to put it all back together. I'll show you how to reset the timing. Once we put the pump back in, we'll put the flywheel back on and we'll reset the timing on it, and then we'll be ready to put everything back together and go to the other side. Alright, so we have got everything ready to go, gaskets all cleaned up, so we only got a couple things to do before we can start putting things back together. And number one is to get all of this nasty stuff that's down in the bottom of this motor out of here, because all it's going to do is stop up my filter. And so what I want to do is soak up all of that and try to scrape that out of there. Alright, so we got all the goopy stuff out of there, and so now our oil filter stands a fighting chance of not getting stopped up when we fire this bike back up, and that may have been the problem. So now we're ready to put our little oil pump back in. So in order to make sure that it has a fighting chance, I've got the assembly lube in it, but what I'm going to do is go ahead and pre-fill it with oil, and that way I can make sure that it's going to pump. So what I want to do is actually run it backwards. So if it's in there, crank runs this way, it normally runs this way. And what I want to do is actually crank it backwards until it starts filling up. So all we want to do is just get it on an angle, and then we're going to put some oil in there. And we're going to run it backwards until it runs out the bottom. And that's going to let us know that it's full of oil. Alright, so we can see that it's running out the bottom now. So we stack it back up in there and hold it like this, and it'll keep some of that oil in. So now we've got to make sure our O-rings are on there. And we just slip the little guy back up in there and line him up to that little center post that holds it in place. And we got him reinstalled. Now we just put our bolts back in and we torque them down, and these don't have Loctite on them, so we don't have to worry about Loctite. There we are. So we're back torqued to spec. Now we just got to reinstall our little gear and our little chain, and we'll start putting everything back together, and then we can work out our timing. Alright, so for this little bolt, we want to put some blue Loctite on because we want to make sure that that doesn't rattle loose. Now all we got left is the cover, and we'll get ready to reset our timing. Alright, so we're getting ready to install the flywheel again, but because it moved when I put the oil pump on, my key needs to go back over to this direction so everything will line back up and I'll have my timing right. I'll check it when I'm done, but I know if I put the key in, get it back over here, line those two holes up, I'll be spot back on again. Alright, so if we look in our little window, that's our timing window for the rear cylinder, we ought to see a T when we're lined up on the right. And so right there is our little T with our little line, so we know that we didn't affect our timing any. And up top up here, we can see that our dot is still pointing up to the dot, so everything's good. Well, alright, so we can take the cover back off and go ahead and continue putting everything together.